Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to completely change how you look at resistance training. For decades, lifting weights has been weighed down by this whole meathead stereotype. But as we'll uncover today, stepping into the weight room is actually a highly sophisticated, science-backed activity that transforms both our biology and our neurology.
So let me ask you something. Did you know your brain loves weightlifting just as much as your muscles do? Seriously, it's true. We almost always think about strength training purely in terms of what we can see in the mirror. But what if I told you the most profound changes happening when you lift are actually totally invisible? Long before a muscle ever grows, your brain is quietly reaping incredible, life-changing benefits.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the brain on weights. Then, the anatomy of muscle hypertrophy. After that, tension, velocity, and recruitment. Then, the two faces of fatigue. And finally, supercompensation and ultimate recovery.
All right, part one, the brain on weights and its hidden neurological hooks. Look, every single movement you make starts right up in your brain. To lift heavier weights, your brain literally has to rewire itself. It learns to recruit motor units way more effectively, essentially leveling up your mind-muscle connection. But it goes so much deeper than just getting stronger. Research shows resistance training actually encourages brain regeneration. It increases your gray matter volume, which is absolutely crucial because that helps protect against cognitive decline and conditions like Alzheimer's. Plus, lifting floods your system with dopamine. It's a powerful natural weapon for improving your general mental health and fighting off symptoms of anxiety and depression.
And this neurological boost, it plays a massive role in how our bodies handle stress. We all know chronic stress wreaks havoc on us by keeping our fight-or-flight sympathetic nervous system completely dialed up. Well, resistance training actually helps regulate the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Clinical studies show that lifting weights actively drives down cortisol levels. It acts like a reset button, bringing our fight-or-flight mode and our rest and digest parasympathetic system back into a healthy, harmonious balance. Moving on to part two, anatomy of muscle hypertrophy, let's talk about the visible brawn. This brings us to hypertrophy. Simply put, hypertrophy is an increase in the size of a muscle, or its cross-sectional area. It boils down to an increase in the size or the number of myofibrils, specifically actin and myosin, packed inside a given muscle fiber. Now, while both our slow-twitch and fast-twitch fibers can grow, it's really our type 2 glycolytic muscle fibers that experience this hypertrophy on a much, much larger scale. So, the crucial point here is that this new muscle mass isn't just for show. It is incredibly metabolically expensive tissue. Fat-free muscle mass accounts for roughly 65 to 70% of your resting metabolic rate. Think about that for a second. Building muscle literally transforms your body into an engine that burns more energy around the clock, even elevating your calorie burn for a solid 24 to 48 hours after your workout. Part 3, tension, velocity, and recruitment. These are the core mechanics of growth. It all kicks off with mechanical tension. You can think of mechanical tension as the primary biological switch that flips on muscle growth. When your muscle fibers experience high levels of force, little sensors called mechanoreceptors detect that tension. They then initiate the downstream protein synthesis pathways that actually build the muscle. And here's a really cool quirk of biology. Because of the force-velocity relationship, it's actually involuntarily slow movement speeds, like when you're just grinding out that final heavy repetition and your body refuses to move any faster, that produce the absolute highest force and tension inside those individual fibers. But here's the catch. Tension alone isn't going to do the trick if it doesn't reach the right fibers. Enter Henneman's size principle. This principle tells us that our body recruits motor units in order of their size. It's super efficient. It starts with the small, low-threshold endurance fibers and only calls in the big guns, the large, high-threshold type 2 fibers, when the external force absolutely demands it. So to reach those highly responsive, growth-prone type 2 fibers, we need maximum motor unit recruitment. And you get there either by lifting really heavy loads right out of the gate or by taking lighter weights all the way to absolute task failure. If we zoom all the way into a single repetition, the journey is just incredible. It starts as an electrical spark right in your motor cortex. That signal shoots down to the muscle, triggering a flood of calcium ions, which then allows the energy molecule ATP to bind to a myosin head. The ATP breaks down to ADP and a phosphate, the myosin grabs onto an actin filament, and as it releases the ADP, the myosin physically pulls the actin. This shortens the sarcomere. Millions of these tiny mechanical engines grabbing and pulling all at once.
That's what allows you to actually lift the weight. It is an absolute masterpiece of cellular machinery. Which brings us to part 4, the 2 faces of fatigue. Time for a plot twist. We usually just think of fatigue as feeling tired, but objectively, it comes in 2 distinct flavors. First, there's central nervous system fatigue, which is basically a failure of our internal electrical grid. And then there's peripheral fatigue, which is a breakdown of our mechanical engine right there at the muscle fiber. And this brilliantly illustrates the real roadblocks we face during a tough workout. Let's take a look at the electrical grid first. Supraspinal fatigue actually happens in your brain. As you're lifting, that intense burning sensation and the buildup of metabolites send huge warning signals back to your sensory cortex. Your brain perceives this massive spike in effort and discomfort, and it essentially says, "Nope, we're done." It actively reduces your central motor command. This drop literally blocks you from voluntarily recruiting those high-threshold type 2 muscle fibers. So your brain is actually forcing you to quit before your muscle has even reached true physiological failure. Crazy, right? Then, on the peripheral side, we have the mechanical breakdown. Remember that whole cellular dance with the calcium ions we just talked about? Well, opening and closing those calcium gates over and over again is kind of a leaky process. As calcium ions build up in places they shouldn't be, they trigger calpain enzymes. And these enzymes start to physically degrade the structural junctions of the cell. It's known as excitation-contraction coupling failure. This drastically drops the amount of force your muscles can produce, and it's a huge reason why you feel so incredibly sore for days after a heavy workout. All right, part 5, supercompensation and ultimate recovery. Let's look at the blueprint. You see, recovery isn't just about getting back to normal. It's about supercompensation. When you subject your body to mechanical tension and metabolic stress, you cause controlled muscle damage. This kicks off an inflammatory response, which, believe it or not, is exactly what we want here, because it releases crucial growth factors. Your body then goes to work, repairing itself to be larger and stronger than its previous baseline. It's an evolutionary adaptation to make sure that the exact same workout won't cause the exact same damage next time around. Now, what's really interesting about this is how we actually apply it in the gym. The National Strength and Conditioning Association gives us a pretty precise blueprint for maximizing this hypertrophy. They recommend working in the 6 to 12 repetition range, using 65% to 85% of your 1-rep max, taking about 60 seconds of rest between your sets, and hitting multiple sets per muscle group. This specific formula creates the absolute greatest elevation in your primary anabolic hormones, like testosterone and growth hormone. It essentially sets the perfect stage for supercompensation. But hey, to build the house, you need the bricks, right? To maximize the cellular repair process, the science points to a very specific daily target. You want to consume between 1.2 and 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Without this vital nutritional resource, those protein synthesis pathways we worked so hard to turn on, they simply won't have the raw materials they need to construct those larger myofibrils. And finally, we have the ultimate unsung hero of the entire process, sleep. Research consistently shows that we desperately need 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night for this whole system to work. It's during those hours that your central nervous system clears out all that accumulated supraspinal fatigue we talked about, and your body actually undergoes true tissue repair. Skimp on your sleep, and you completely short-circuit the entire supercompensation cycle. So we've seen today that lifting weights is basically a masterclass in human biology. It's this incredibly delicate balance of neurology, mechanical tension, and cellular repair. You now understand the invisible mechanisms that are actually dictating your strength and your growth. So I'll leave you with this. Armed with this deep biomechanical knowledge, next time you step into the gym, how will you manage your internal grid to push past the limits of fatigue? Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer today. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.